Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy with me, your host, Zakiya and Jabbar. I am delighted today to be joined by a good friend of mine, Professor Mark Warren. He and I have been somewhat joined at the hip for a couple of years now. I had the honor of being a part of a book project that he pulled together several years ago, highlighting the work of grassroots education justice advocates. In fact, I had the first chapter in that book, so I was very honored to be a part of that. Let me take a moment and read a little bit more about Mark and who he is, and just a brief bio of all of some of the work that he's done in the last several decades. So Mark Warren is a professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He studies and works with community, parent, and youth organizing groups seeking to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and American democratic life. Warren is the author of 5 books, most recently, Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out, Voices from the Front Lines of the Educational Justice Movement. That is the book that I was referenced that I had opportunity to be a part of. And so Mark is also a part of organizing and movement building, including the People's Think Tank on Educational Justice, the Urban Research-Based Action Network, and Special Interest Group on Community and Youth Organizing in the American Education Research Association. He has won a number of awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, and was recently selected as a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, otherwise known as AERA. He is married to Roberta Udo, a Boston public school teacher, and together they have raised 2 beautiful daughters. Mark, welcome to the Building Power broadcast. Feel free to just jump right in. Tell us a little bit more about you. Tell us how you got into I guess the work that you're doing now, where you're partnering with community and parent groups to write about our work, not just study us and project onto us, but really work in community with us to tell our stories or allow us to tell our stories in a way that's fair and equitable. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Zakiya, for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share some of my work with you and your audience, and to, hopefully have an interesting conversation with you in partnership, as all of our work together has been. So, thanks so much. As Zakiya said, I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I think, unlike a lot of other professors and scholars, though, I am not interested in just sitting in an ivory tower and writing about the world as I see it down below me, but I feel it's important for scholars to be activist scholars, or sometimes I call myself a community engaged scholar, to come out and work with communities who are struggling for change. And I'm not alone. There are a lot of us. There's a growing number of us, and I think particularly younger scholars of color, women, are often feel that the academy, the university, can become sometimes part of the problem instead of part of the solution, and that it can be a kind of force to maintain the status quo as opposed to becoming a force to ally with grassroots organizers to create change. And so, I was a little bit older when I started my graduate program. I'm actually a sociologist, and so I really had my story that led me to graduate school, I think, has really influenced the way I do the work that I do. And Zakiya knows this. I grew up in a blue collar family and community in Springfield, Massachusetts, segregated, but all white segregated. We don't usually talk about all white segregated communities, but that's what it was. Um, but my father had a big influence on me, and he was a little unusual. He was a strong labor activist, really kind of a New Deal Democrat, true and true. But I think, unlike a lot of other white blue collar men at that time, he was also a very strong anti-racist and racial justice supporter. And so he really raised me to believe, first of all, that working people had to organize and fight if they were going to get anything in this world. And secondly, that working people across racial lines really had to get together. And getting together meant, supporting at that time the civil rights movement and the aftermath of the civil rights movement, but to support racial justice causes and feminist causes. And he was very broad-minded. So I went to college and actually had a full scholarship to go to Harvard College. And got there, got a little radicalized, and also kind of alienated as a kind of a small town blue collar kid at Harvard at that time. Any case, I left and went out and became an organizer. Felt it was important that if I really believed in these values, I shouldn't be sitting in college. I should be out organizing. So I became a labor organizer and a community organizer. And I did that for many years. And then eventually I did go back to college. So my father was very happy about that, since he did not have the opportunity to go to college. So he felt it was important. He was happy that I was dedicating my life to working people, but also felt that I, wanted me to have a college degree. Anyway, I ended up going into academics, but I wanted to do it. I felt I could do it in a way that where my scholarship, my research could be in support of groups and connected to them. And when I got to Harvard, I discovered that a lot of sociologists thought about people kind of as fodder for their academic theorizing. And I really rejected that. And that sort of started me on a journey. And I think I'm still on a journey. I'm on a journey of learning how to do this work. And it always grows and changes. And that's exciting. And, I think that I really believe that the work I do as a scholar is to be in support of social and racial justice movements, that I'm an ally, I'm part of those movements. And so my scholarship needs to reflect that. And that I've always believed that, regular people and community organizers have knowledge, have wisdom, are theorists, are constantly theorizing about the kind of society that we're living in and what to do about it, and comparing and learning from each other. And that's really what theorists do. And so I want to learn from people and with people, and have dedicated my work to trying to document the struggles that people of color, a lot of my work has been in low-income communities of color, documenting the struggles and the organizing that parents like Zakiya, Black parents and young people and students, to fight for educational justice and racial equity. And so that's really what led me to this work. And I've been doing it now for, I guess, 25 years. And we can talk some more about that, but that's a little bit about where I come from and why I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think what I heard is that so like your own experience, right, as a young person, growing up in a working class family, as you mentioned, certainly informs how you work with communities today. I remember, and I, reflect on often how you and I met, and I kind of, I feel like, not necessarily forced my way in, but like when you told me about the project that you were doing, I said, "Oh, you have to talk to us. Like you've got to come to Dayton. This is exactly what's
Right.
happening." And really, as they say, the rest is history. You included us, right? Like you, and I think the way that I pitched it is that a lot of the organizers and work that we hear about, or at least that we know about, right, tends to be on the coast, right? So either the East
Mm,
Coast or the West Coast. And many times we don't necessarily hear about the struggles of African Americans in Middle America.
right.
And I think that's true even in the political scene, right? Like African Americans in the South and in the Midwest are sometimes just erased altogether in most recent, kind of struggles. Of course, Ferguson changed that a little bit. Now
Mm,
there's some resources and support that's lifting up the work that is happening there. But one of the things that I learned is that just because you haven't heard about the work, or like the work is happening, I've learned that everywhere that I've gone in this country, there are grassroots Black folks organizing everywhere, pushing back, right?
right.
This whole movement for the school to prison pipeline, as we all know, started in the Delta of Mississippi,
Right.
where you have, working class Black families who started to organize themselves to stop not just the school to prison pipeline, but corporal punishment and all of these really backwards practices that were continuing to harm Black children.
Right.
And I'm really happy, and I feel like your own experience was helped you to really be able to connect to me in a way like, well, I think your story is important. I think what you're saying and what's happening in Ohio is really critical, particularly because of the kind of movement that we were able to make in a very conservative state. Do you
Yeah.
mind sharing a little bit about your experience when you came to Dayton and talked to not just myself, but you also talked to parents that we worked with? You saw, a little bit of the community. You saw the library, like you saw and was able to see the deindustrialization and the
Right.
poverty that exists in Middle America. I'd be happy
Yeah.
just for you to kind of reflect on that.
Sure. Um, so I had started a project to try to document uh, the organizing work that Black and Brown families and parents and students were doing to combat the school to prison pipeline. And your audience probably knows what that is, but just briefly, it's a set of zero tolerance, racially discriminatory school discipline policies, suspensions and expulsions, and related policing activity in schools and metal detectors that all serve to push children out of school, particularly number one, Black boys, but also Black girls and kids and children of color more broadly, out of school and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. And this is not a small problem or phenomenon. Studies have shown that 75% of all Black students in the entire state of Texas are suspended at some point in their secondary school years. 75%. I think it's 82% of Black boys are. I mean, almost every single one.
Yeah.
And if you do not have a high school degree in this country, that is the number one predictor of ending up in the criminal justice system. So 2/3 of young Black men or Black men without a high school degree will end up in prison at some point in their lives. 2/3. And of course, you with a criminal record, you may lose your right to vote, your right to public housing. Employers can legally discriminate against you. So I think it's important to understand this is not just a few misguided policies we're talking about. We're talking about a system that is really in place here, one of racial domination that really serves to perpetuate poverty and lack of power in poor and working class communities of color in this country. And I think, Zakiya, you're right that we hear more about what's going on the coasts. But places like Dayton, in some ways are similar to the Springfield, Massachusetts that I grew up in, a small, medium-sized industrial town.
That's why I
That,
said I thought you
yeah,
connected to me on
yeah,
that level.
I felt like I was in Springfield. Both the positives of working class life and community, but also the negatives of deindustrialization, factories closing, people being out of work. If you don't have a good education, you don't have many alternatives. You end up in these very out of work or in very low wage kinds of jobs and really struggling. So when I came out to see Zakiya, I felt kindred with that. And the powerful stories that parents were telling, including Zakiya's own story, which I'm sure she's shared with you before, but of her son being pushed out of preschool at the age of 3. The school to prison pipeline starts in preschool, and particularly for Black boys and Black and brown children, and it starts then and then just accelerates through the time. So hearing these stories, I felt it wasn't just that I ended up including Zakiya. She said she was the first essay in the book. Oh, and by the way, this is the book we were talking about. Oops, lift us up, don't push us out.
Yeah,
Voices from the front
let's tell
lines.
people where they can grab this book, and I believe we have a link that we can put down in the comments for people. But yeah, this is a Lift Us Up
Sure.
book, Don't Push Us Out. Lift Us Up Movement.org. So people can have that in the comments. You can go, there's a free download, I believe, right, Mark, on Kindle that people can get.
Currently, the book is available free as a download on Kindle and Google Play Books as well. So yes, and I think the whole premise of the book is that people who are organizing, who are victims, but not only victims, but victims of the school to prison pipeline, or educational injustice, racism, and who have taken on a journey to become organizers and activists and advocates in their community, that their stories really need to be lifted up and told, and they should have the opportunity to tell it for themselves. And I'd spent most of my career, and I still do, writing about the work that people are doing, and I always include their own voices. There's lots of quotations so people are represented. But in this book, we wanted to do something different. We wanted to have people who don't normally have a chance to write, to be part of the literary and scholarly world, to actually write their own essays. And so we, not everybody has the time and inclination and develop skill sets to do that. So we used our talents and resources to help people, but it's their word, it's their essay and their words and in their voice. And I felt it was very important for a Black parent to start the book. That this movement has really been grounded, first off, in African American communities among parents and also students, and that voice needed to start. That's the grounding of a larger movement. Now, there's a lot of other voices in that movement that have to become part of it, including scholars like myself. My voice is in this book too, and we need a broad movement, but we also need one that's accountable. And if I could say one more thing about this,
Of course, yeah.
yeah, it was really, as Zakiya said, African American parents and young people in the Mississippi Delta who were the first to identify zero tolerance school discipline policy and name the school to prison pipeline. And they called it this prevention of schoolhouse to jailhouse at the time. And this was the late 90s. Nobody was talking about the school to prison pipeline. I had never heard of the term before. And it was really those parents and those young people who named it, who started telling their stories when there was no data out there, and starting to organize to change things. They were very concerned at that time too with juvenile justice facilities, that young people were sent to so-called training schools, which I put in quotes because they were really jails in which young Black children particularly were being brutalized and hogtied, and all kinds of horrible things, really. And so they started that organizing, and then other national actors started to hear about it and come down to Mississippi to learn. And eventually I took my own journey down to Mississippi to learn and spent time with folks down there too. But this is part of that hierarchy of knowledge, where certain people's wisdom and knowledge is not recognized. But in fact, if it wasn't for parents like Zakiya and a little bit earlier, those folks in the Mississippi Delta, we wouldn't be talking about the school prison pipeline today. And so that, I think, part of the purpose of the work that I do is to document that and to help lift up those voices and bring them into onto the national stage through books and through lots of other presentations that we've done together in a lot of different audiences.
Yeah, that's right. And I had the pleasure of doing a presentation with you at the AERA. We actually had a presidential session. I'll let you explain why that's so prestigious in that
Sure.
environment. But Linda Darling Hammond, which she is very respected in the education justice community, in the ecosystem. And I remember we had such a great turnout, right? There were so many questions. And the fact that you centered in this very academic, very heavily academic space, you brought in the community to this presidential session to actually hear from us, not just hear from us, Mark, but I have to say you really centered us as the experts, not just in our own experiences, right? Because that can even be paternalistic, but experts in actual being able to know, like, okay, this is what we believe we need for our community and what equity looks like for us, right? And being able to marry the two with you, Dr. Joyce King, as well as someone else who I've had on this show, who I believe her work also is also done in community, with Black and brown parents around the country. So if you could just share a little bit more about like the thinking. I don't know if there was any pushback when you introduced the proposal to bring in community members to be a part of this presidential session, but I would just love to, if you want to share any of those tensions, if you've run into tensions being in the academic space, and how you've, maneuvered that, and really pushed them to see, that families and communities aren't to just be studied, right? We're to be partners.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, so that's a big question. So part of my work is to not just to work with groups and to write books and articles, but to engage and advocate within the academy for a different way of operating, and a different way of thinking about what it takes to build knowledge, particularly knowledge that's going to promote equity and change systems. So a lot of my work is in education. Obviously, we're talking about that. And I really believe that the sort of dominant model of education reformers is really broken. It's about experts who are doing research disconnected, and then that research suggests policies, and they work with policy makers and educators at district and state levels, and they devise solutions that are then imposed down on communities, on schools and communities, without any input from those people. And it just hasn't worked. It's part of the system that perpetuates failure of our educational system in regards, particularly to low-income communities of color. And we really need a new model. And for me, that new model, a key part, a fundamental part of that new model is, racial and educational justice movements, where people who are themselves the most impacted by injustice have a voice and a role in research and policy making. And so I try to demonstrate that by, when we go to the American Education Research Association. This is the predominant, largest national association of people who do education research of all sorts, and 15,000 people gather every year, although we're not gathering in person this year, but normally we do. And we sit in a hotel room and talk with each other for 4 or 5 days, and everybody goes home. And that's part of that broken model. And so one of the things we try to do is have sessions where we get people out and we sponsor them in the community. So I think this time we were in Toronto, and we actually went out into the community and met with people who had organized the police-free schools movement in Toronto. So that was an example. But the other, only some people are going to get on, take a cab or get on public transportation and go out of the event. But people do that. But then we want to, or I want to bring people onto the stage. And every year there's a set of presidential sessions that are the president of the association gets to decide on, and they're featured sessions. And so I proposed a session on the school prison pipeline that would bring together and center the voices of people who are doing organizing like Zakiya, but also in conversation with people like Linda Darling Hammond, who is a very well-known famous, if you will, education researcher, policy-oriented researcher, and a really good person who, I think wants to engage with people. So and those kinds of sessions, I think, get a lot more publicity, and people are interested in coming and hearing, and they're at a more of a plenary type arrangement. And so it's interesting, Zakiya, the push. Do I get pushback? 99% of what's done at the association is scholars presenting their research papers to each other. And so in some ways, when you present something different, some people like it. This is different. It gets a little attention. So, but I've had I constantly am out trying to help support younger people to do this work, and to say, you can make a career out of this, because, scholars, we have families, we have to feed our families, we need jobs, we need careers, if we've chosen to do it this way. But, we don't want to be pushed into the box. We want to, have careers that represent our values. And I've had a rocky road with it. I have lost my tenure case at Harvard University because of the work I do.
I wanted you to talk about that. I didn't want to introduce it because I wanted to make sure you would be comfortable.
Yeah.
But please,
Yeah.
This is important, because I want people to know that when you're in this movement for justice and equity, sometimes there are sacrifices. And
Right.
for those of us who are students of critical race theory, we know that the same happened to Derek Bell,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he was basically pushed out of Harvard as well,
Yeah.
for advocating
Yeah.
for women, actually,
Yeah.
for women of color. And so please tell the audience about that experience and how that came about and what you were doing, because I also believe you were advocating. um, and
Yeah.
so just tell us about the politics of how being in partnership, in real authentic partnership with working class and poor people, can oftentimes have consequences and sacrifices that you have to make.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I will say, I have a job. I'm a tenured professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, so I'm okay. And I say that also because I don't want to, it's a double-edged thing. Yes, there are, there are sacrifices, but you also, you can make a go of this in the academy, and many of us have. And so it's something important for people who are thinking about this to know that it's possible to do it. But at the most elite levels, being tenured at Harvard, that's an institution that's controlled, and there's a it's partly about being a white male power structure. I'm myself a white male, so it's not only about that, but it's about a certain dominant mode of knowledge production, and the people who have that power wanting to keep that for themselves, frankly. And that's how I see it. But I went there, I had the opportunity to go there, and I came as an associate professor without tenure, which was a normal situation. And I had to, when I first got there, I had to decide, am I going to spend all my time trying to figure out what's going to get me tenure at Harvard, or am I going to do the work that I really believe in, and do my best work that I feel is meaningful? And so that's what I did. And part of it was doing the work I did. We did a book called, I got that book here too, all my books here, but since I write books, A Match on Dry Grass, um, with a colleague, Karen Mapp, who some people may know, a terrific educator and faculty member at Harvard, and 15 doctoral students. So a lot of students were interested in this organizing work. They wanted to be community engaged. They wanted to go out into communities, and went all over we sent them all over the country, or we went all over the country with them, and we produced this book together. I also, during this time, wrote a book on white people who had become anti-racist activists, and some ways maybe a little bit ahead of its time. That
I
was
was going to
very
say that's pretty popular now.
now, this was during the Obama era, when people were trying to say we're in a post-racial America, and
I know that was a hard sell back then,
yeah, I
right?
mean, I mean, many people knew that wasn't true, but still, it was a different time. And I think at that time, and still true, white people who do this work, can be perceived as a threat, and to other white people. And so, in any case, and I also, as Zakiya might mention, I'm not someone who sits quietly in the corner and does my work. I was also an advocate at Harvard. I was at the Graduate School of Education for equity and diversity issues there, and I actually helped form and chaired a committee on equity and diversity. And so we were advocating for changes at the institution. We brought the struggle home as well. And I think that was, better or worse, that was a piece. If they're going to give Mark tenure, he's not going to sit in back and do this thing quietly. He's going to be a force. He's going to have 15 students working with him. He's going to be chairing committees. And, but I'll also say, I mean, this is very complicated. There is a vote of the faculty, and as I understand it, 85% of the faculty voted in favor of my tenure case, and it was vetoed by the dean at the time.
So
So
85% of the people voted for your
yeah,
tenure, but it was
yeah,
vetoed by the dean.
yeah, it was
For
vetoed by the
people
dean.
who don't like understand the politics of like the university, can you
well,
break that down? Like,
well, that's the official rules at Harvard, where there is it's a long, complicated process. I won't
sure, I
bore
mean it's
anybody
very
with the detail, but
undemocratic, really.
it's not that, yes, there's a vote of the senior faculty at some point in the process. If you get that far, there's all these hurdles to get there. I got there. There was a vote. It was 85% in favor, but there were a few powerful people who, as I understand it, were against it and had the ear of the dean. And at Harvard, the dean has to make a affirmative decision to take the case forward to the central university administration, and they don't have to. And if they choose not to, then that is the end of the story. And there were protests, and students took over the dean's office and sat in, and it was very gratifying to feel not just me personally being supported, but the kind of work that I do was important to students to take that action. But kind of all the wagons round up and the president's office comes in and supports, and it's there aren't really other avenues past that. So that's what happened. So it's a power structure is really what it is. And I don't usually talk about this so much in so much detail publicly, but that is what happened, and it's not a secret. And you can Google. I was on the front page of the Boston Globe, or the protests about my case were on the front page of the Boston Globe. So it's a little bit of a
Now
secret
that
about
part
it.
I never knew, Mark.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
never
yeah,
knew you were on the front page of the Boston Globe. That's
yeah.
amazing.
I did. Yeah, I made it on that. And so, I did. If you don't get tenure, as people may or may not know, you have to leave. It's not that you can stay without tenure. So you're up or down at that point. And so I moved on and was able to get a good position. But I don't want to minimize these struggles. But as Zakiya, I think, alluded to, I've actually also won several very prestigious awards for the work I
Yeah,
do.
let's
And
talk
and
about what you're
oh,
up to
okay,
now.
yeah.
Right?
So I mean,
Like
I
you just
say,
came back from Stanford on this
yeah,
very nice fellowship. And yeah, let's talk about what's
sure,
happening
yeah.
now.
So I've been privileged to have that kind of a recognition as well, and I try to take that as a recognition, not just to me personally, but of my partners and the work that I do. That's what's being recognized here, and I like that. I'm glad that happens because it's not just benefits for me; it's encouragement for younger scholars to say, you know what, you can do this work and you can get recognized for it, and fellowship. So I won a fellowship to Stanford at Stanford University in something called the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, and it's a very cushy, lovely place in Stanford University. And you go there, and it's a center on the top of a hill, and there's 30 plus other scholars who are all there for the year, and they cover you usually on sabbatical, and they provide financial coverage so that you can spend the year there in terms of having salary support. And that's the contradiction is that I'm up there to write a book on organizing and movement building against the school to prison pipeline. But if you don't have those opportunities and you're teaching all the time and doing a lot of administrative work, you just don't have time to write books. So these are very important kinds of things. So it was a privilege to be there. It was also it is the epitome of being up on a hill looking down on everybody else in a pretty isolated area. So you just have to take your values there, and I'm just myself. I am who I am wherever I am. And so I gave my talks there, and I engaged with other people and advocated and promoting for the kind of work that I believe in while I was there. And it was great. And I have just finished actually the draft manuscript of the book, and that'll be. And Zakiya, actually, her story starts that book off too, because once again, I believe that the voice and the stories of not just Black parents who have been, abused by the system or victims of the system, but Black parents and others who have become, organizers and advocates in their communities. I mean, that's what the story is about. It's about the experiences of the school to prison pipeline, but of building a movement of people to change it, as they've done in Dayton, but now, also all over the country.
That's right. Yeah, I was gonna say you just sent me the draft a couple days ago, and I have to dig in and read it and see if there's any edits. But I'm excited
Yeah,
about the second book project that I get to partner with you on to really highlight and center what is now my life's work. Right, it's my
right,
life's calling is being in this education justice movement to ensure fairness, equity, and that all children really can have access to a world-class education.
right.
Speaking of that, you are also working with a number of other organizations. I know that you travel the country from, east and west, and of course in the south. And are there any newer organizations that you added to this second book that you'd like to highlight here?
Sure. I mean, yeah, as you say, there's organizations, that come up all the time. I did this second book. I worked with lots of groups. One of the key partners was the Dignity in Schools campaign, and Zakiya, as people I'm sure know, was the national field organizer for them for a number of years. So they've been partners, and when I do this work, I try to form my partnerships, and I try to, build the relationships, build trust. You have to, I feel it's important. I am a white male professor, and I'm studying and working with communities of people different from me, and we do that in the context of white supremacy and of the hierarchy of the academy that we've been talking about. And so, I like to put those issues on the table, and let's get to know each other. Let you get to know who I am and why I'm doing this kind of work, and have an open conversation about how this project is going to go and what your concerns are and who's going to benefit from this. It shouldn't just be me writing books and getting jobs. It should be, books that also create different kinds of support and context that helps the movement. We actually produced, as part of this project, a toolkit for community groups to use in organizing, and that you can find that
That's
on the
right.
Dignity in Schools campaign website. And so, trying to be thoughtful about what are the range of things that can come out of our partnership, not just a book, but as important as that is, and for me, that's pretty central, but other things as well. And so, I spent a lot of time in South Los Angeles with Cadre. It's a parent organizing group, mostly African American, Latino, Latinx parents. Maisie Chin is their director, and they were. We talked about the Mississippi groups being, in many ways, the first to raise the alarm and to call out the school to prison pipeline. Well, then it was Black and brown parents in South LA who were
Yeah,
the
they've been
first.
guests on the show.
Oh, they have. Okay. Well, they were the first to win, to actually defeat zero tolerance as a policy in a district.
That's right.
They were part of the force that got the Los Angeles Unified School District to adopt school-wide positive behavior supports as an alternative. And so that was really just a huge echo across the whole country that you can actually do this and change, not just name the school to prison pipeline, but actually start to change policies. So they're I think very important in there, and they are featured in the book. And I think one of the things that very powerful for anybody who's gone to South LA. I mean, the incredible militarized and criminalization system in Los Angeles. They're the first in the country, the largest prison system in the country.
Right.
And,
Their school district actually had military grade weapons and
yeah,
tanks through the 1033 program, which is a federal program that
right,
reappropriates military equipment from the military to local police departments in this country. And some school districts like Chicago and LA have their own police departments
yeah, yeah,
within the school district.
right,
So
right.
that's scary. And I feel like a lot of people don't know that.
No,
But
no.
another group in South LA, which I'm not sure if they're featured in the book, but the Labor and Community
Yes,
Strategy
they are.
Center, they organized and got LA to not only get rid of the tanks and military grade weapons at the school district, right? What are they going to do with tanks at the schools, right?
Yeah,
But they also got them to apologize to
yeah,
the families and to the community for even accepting it.
yeah. Because what's the mentality of a school district that's going to accept semi-automatic weapons and a tank? I mean, what is what is that saying about how the culture in the
Right.
institution and how the whole place is operating?
Yeah.
And so yes, that they are included. They're included in the book because in many ways they were one of the first organizing groups to take on the issue of police in schools. And others have too. Black Organizing Project was early on in that, and there've been other
Yes, shout
groups.
out to
But
Black
yeah,
Organizing Project for getting the
yeah,
school board in Oakland this summer to dismantle
right,
the
right.
school police division within the school board. That's a huge win.
Yeah. And I think people saw over the summer all of a sudden a significant number for the first time of school districts defunding police and ending contracts with police. But they don't know where did this come from, right? What it came from is the patient organizing that was going on in places like Oakland with the Black Organizing Project, or in South LA by the Labor Community Strategy Center, and others have been involved too in supporting that through the years. Um, these were the places that laid the foundation. Or in Denver with Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, which is a Latino organizing group that's been trying to organize for police free schools for many years. And it's mostly the places that actually won the changes And defunded police were basically the places that organizing had been going on for the past 10 years. And people don't know that. There was a foundation
That is
there.
so true. There's a
Yeah,
foundation.
yeah, they already had the policy proposals in hand. When the mass protest arose, they had already been proposing these policies. They had been building relationships with some of the school board members and had allies on the inside already because of the work that they were doing. And then the protests, pushed that over the top. So I think these are the stories that people don't know, right? They see the headlines, but they don't know what it really takes to organize systematically over a sustained and persistent way to create change. The mass protests are so important. They raise national consciousness. They really do push for change, but you also need the patient organizing processes over a period of time to really push these things through. And then to hold the districts accountable for real change.
The
You know,
implementation.
the implementation issue is huge. We can defund police, but well, what's the alternative? What are there going to be increased surveillance instead? I mean, we don't, so you
We
can't.
haven't even talked about that, right?
I know, right?
All these
Yeah,
technological, AI, which is artificial intelligence. You're
right.
right. I
Yeah,
mean, privacy is like non-existent, right?
yeah,
It's really amazing because and you know that this is our colleague Marika Peppercorn, which
yeah,
we'll have to invite her on to really do
yeah.
a deep dive about how we are having to push back against this new form of criminalization,
Right,
which is the data tracking, the predictive analytics, where they use
right,
certain measurements to predict that you will be a criminal, and they're actually using data that is already skewed and already like chock full of racial bias.
right, right. Exactly. And then the new forms of surveillance and criminalization that can come through online teaching. Teachers looking right into the homes of
We're
students,
seeing
and
that
where are the
now.
protections there? Yeah, there was just a case now in Louisiana where I guess a teacher saw a BB gun in a room with one of her students. I think he was fifth grade, and he's been expelled, I believe, from the school. I don't know if you followed that. I'm not sure what the latest on
The
that is.
young man in Colorado I know was expelled. I haven't been following
Yeah,
the case out of Louisiana, but I wouldn't be surprised. And this is in a virtual learning environment. They
yeah,
figured out a way to still criminalize our kids.
I know. Yeah, and there's another group there that is also in the book, Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, Flick,
Yay!
and
Shout out to Gina
yeah,
and Flick.
Gina Womack and other of her colleagues there. Another group that's really started working on this almost 20 years ago now. A lot of the Southern African American organizing really does go back to the beginning of this, and they were working also on juvenile justice, trying to shut down that Tallulah detention center, which they did eventually shut down. Another horrible, brutal place for children. So, and that's in a situation that's now very private, what we call privatized. So after Hurricane Katrina, they basically closed the regular public schools, or most of them, and turned the district into a charter district, which now it's entirely charter schools. And so we'll debate the merits, but the reality is that many charter schools have harsher and more zero tolerance push out policies than regular public schools. And the issue of accountability and democracy is real there, because they're not elected school boards, and they're public schools in the sense that they're free and publicly accountable supposedly, but they don't have elected school boards. And so anyway, so they're trying to navigate, how do you really address the school to prison pipeline in a place where you may have 40 different school boards that you have to some
Yeah,
infrastructure in the school. So anyway, we
I
go back.
noticed. Yeah, no, absolutely. And no, I noted that some of those families have started to work at the state level to try to curtail some of that.
Right,
Yeah, Louisiana is certainly different. A lot of the southern states are certainly um, very interesting in terms of fighting for educational justice. There isn't a strong, I would say, Black-led infrastructure to
right,
ensure education equity in the Southeast. I think you see it in pockets, of course, like in Atlanta, that's a huge city. There are certainly organizations working there, but so much of the South is rural and it's Black folks in rural communities. But
Right.
a lot of it is because the resources and the like foundations are mostly on the coast, right? They're in
Yeah.
Silicon Valley or New York City. And so sometimes there just isn't any interest on the part of the folks who control the resources to make those kind of investments. Now, I see that that's changing when it comes to voting. There's a
Right.
lot of resources because of the shifting demographics, right? You have a
Right.
reverse migration of African Americans leaving these very expensive places like New York and New Jersey and the East Coast. And of course, a lot of folks are also retiring and leaving the Midwest. And so you're seeing demographic shifts, especially in Georgia and North Carolina. So I'd be interested in seeing if we also at some point have a shift in how we see the funding start to go down there to support families and
Yeah.
communities of color to really build up and ramp up the organizing, because I can tell you, as a product of Alabama public schools, that it
Mm.
wasn't the worst, but I still have family there. I think I did get a good education for the most part. But what I'm seeing that's coming out now, particularly during COVID, there are entire school districts that still haven't gotten their kids online in rural communities because there's literally no infrastructure for online,
Right. Right. Right.
right? So
Well,
it's clearly so there needs to be a shift in helping families and communities build an infrastructure of organizing and advocacy to push for equity. But I'll let you jump in here.
yeah. No, 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 no. Those are, I think, important points. And one of the themes of the new book that we're talking about on School to Prison Pipeline is that relationship between really deep local organizing and a national movement and a national infrastructure. And I think one of the things that I found in doing this research, and I think this is also true in Dayton, is that you know we're talking about small, under-resourced groups, often in conservative areas, facing entrenched systems. And can those, realistically, can those local groups build the power to really shift these deep-seated systems? And obviously, it has to be grounded there, but the existence of this national movement has provided, I think, really important forms of support. Things like I know the Dignity in Schools campaign has their model student code of conduct. So if you want to analyze your discipline policies in your district, you want to propose alternatives, here's your resource that helps you not starting from scratch with that. Small grants, when you can't get grants anywhere else, can come from the national movement. Um, Sharing the lessons and spreading ideas and gaining inspiration, because seeing that you're not alone in rural Louisiana. You're not the only ones facing this problem. There are parents and students organizing across the country. So it's just a whole wide range. And I think once again, I found that the Mississippi groups, we were talking about our friend and colleague Joyce Parker there, I think pioneered and understood from the very beginning that they were isolated in these fairly small rural communities. They weren't going to win on their own. So first they built a statewide network to support each other, and that was about creating change at the state house, but it was also about supporting each other in the driving resources, not pulling resources up and out of these local groups, but getting resources and driving them down. And then that model kind of was also nationalized in some sense, right? So these local struggles are then lifted up, spread around the country, and help each other. So that's one of the issues that I'm trying to deal with in the book. What's the relationship between deep local organizing and national movements? We don't want national movements in the hands of professional advocates in Washington only focused on inside the beltway like politics. That's not the model. But local organizations on their own can't win either. And so how do we create a kind of dynamic movement that is controlled by community groups on the ground and does some work in Washington for sure, but is not solely focused on that and sees its main role as supporting the organizing that's happening in communities.
That leads to my next question. I mean, I feel like you leaned into this a little bit, but so where do we go from here? And I want to give you an opportunity. We haven't talked about this current predicament that we're in now. Like, we're in a pandemic, and
Yeah.
we have, right, schools are closed. Most of them are
Yeah.
virtual and online. And you and I talked, kind of set it up a little bit when we talked about the artificial intelligence and sort of
Mm.
some of these new kind of mechanisms that will be used to criminalize our kids. I want to get your thoughts on something that I brought up on a call that I was on yesterday, with
Mm.
other education advocates with the Wayfinder Foundation. And one of the things that I, brought up to the group and just asked them, like, are you seeing this? Is this idea of digitizing education? We are currently living in a technological revolution where we are going to see an increased amount of technology taking jobs, right, that people used to do. So I don't know if people are aware, but there's this movement for autonomous driving. Autonomous driving
Mm.
means that you won't even need people to drive cars anymore. They will drive themselves. And I know
Yeah.
that it's been somewhat in the media. There were a couple of cities, Pittsburgh was one of them, that piloted self-driving cars. I'm not even sure if you're familiar with this, but these
Yeah.
kind of
No,
things
I
are
heard that.
these. I mean, you were just in Silicon Valley where, Tesla is, right? Tesla
Yeah.
is one of these companies that's really leading the way and pioneering what's called autonomous driving. And, they're saying that eventually we're going to have smart cities where eventually you're not going to even have people in cars. And people think that this can happen literally by 2030. That's 10 years, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is we have this, people don't know, but in the financial industry, it's called fintech. So if people have Cash App or Venmo and you send money to people, that is literally moving banking out of the way, like changing the way that we
Right.
transfer money and bank with each other. PayPal, I believe, was the first, right? So
Right.
technology is disrupting lots of different institutions that probably previously never thought that this could happen, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm thinking about this now in the context of education, Mark. And I said all that to say so that people could have a framework. But I'm thinking about this, and I called this out very early, especially when I saw that LA was the first big national school district to only call for virtual learning. I said, this is a mistake. I said, I think they should have done something way more creative, just to go to the default and say, well, education can just happen virtually. And now I believe that so many districts have set themselves up, right? And unfortunately, teachers' unions as well, to basically have a reduction in force. And I'll tell you what, Mark, this has actually already happened in Dayton, and it broke my heart. Just a month ago, Dayton School Board voted to do one of the biggest rifts that it had done in recent decades, where they laid off tons of teachers,
Wow.
paraprofessionals, nurses, school bus drivers, because guess what? They don't need the school bus drivers,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
Schools are closed. And they're going to do this particularly in school districts that were already suffering for funding because school districts are funded by property taxes.
Right.
And I'm concerned that we're going to continue to widen this opportunity gap because there's so many people who think that, and there were people who were trying to move education online before, but now
Right.
with COVID-19, we're already seeing the increase in that. We're already seeing school boards like Dayton, and I'm sure there's others that we probably haven't heard about because most of our news cycle is around this national presidential election. But people are catching hell, and we don't have any, I believe, any positive models out there right now, outside of pods that have been created by middle class families that really work for all children and
Yeah.
families.
No, and it's been, I think, well, it's been a disaster. And, we're not, we're caught between, is it going to be all online, which, as you say, just widens inequities, or are we going to go back to schools, which are older, unsafe, and putting children and teachers at risk? There's been no creative alternatives in the middle. And you mentioned, my wife Roberta. She's a teacher in Boston Public Schools, a Black female teacher. It's very important. I learn a lot from her and hear a lot through her. And they're just sort of one of the things she has experienced is just this flood of new technology and apps. They're just flooded every, like, I think she got 6 in 1 week that she was supposed
Yeah.
to learn while she was teaching. And so,
And school districts are going to have to cut their budgets next year
right,
because of everything,
yeah,
right? Because
but
there isn't going to be, because we shut down the economy. So there's going to be a ripple effect.
there's
And
gonna be a ripple effect, right?
what I'm concerned about, Mark, is that schools are going to say, oh, well, we don't really even need brick and mortar schools anymore. We're already online. I think we've perfected it. We've done it over 6 to 9 months, and that's where we can make the cuts. And I'm just trying to get your feedback. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a mistake?
Well, I think it's a mistake. I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not, I'm not sure what's going to happen because I see contradictory forces. I also see, for example, in Boston, where I am, a big push to get students back in school, and it doesn't seem that there's a push to keep people only online. But I brought up the apps because I think there's a huge investment going in that direction, right? And once the school district's making that kind of investment, they're not just say, okay, we don't need them anymore. So but I think right now we're not doing either well. We're not doing online well, certainly in urban districts, and we're not doing in person safely and well either. So we're just kind of, the dysfunction of these systems is just perpetuating this. So I don't know whether I think there's going to be a force and there's an economic interest also in the online teaching by these companies that sell these apps and um, platforms like Zoom are making a fortune out of being, online and teaching. And we've seen the economic interest behind the standardized tests. And now they're going to be into all of these. And a lot of, by the way, it's Pearson's, which is behind many of the standardized tests, is also behind many of the online learning platforms. So it's some of the same companies that are really profiting by this off of our families and our children. So I do think it's a scary time. And as you say, there could potentially, there's going to be cuts in the education budget. Certainly, if we don't have a different outcome in many of our elections, that's the direction that we're heading in. And so I don't know, and I think it's difficult. We talked about. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to study and work with the School to Prison Pipeline organizing this, because I felt like actually this is a really successful movement. People don't know that, but it has really, this is a movement that parents color and students have shifted the whole discourse away from zero tolerance. When this thing started, zero tolerance it was in every policy. Teachers unions had it as their official policy. It was in every district's official policy
It
all
sure
across the
was. It
country.
was official
Yeah.
policy.
And
Yeah.
nobody was questioning it. It was just, received wisdom that that's what you did. And that has completely changed. No, even the people who still do it won't defend it. Well, no one will get up and defend. Oh, now we do have some extreme right wingers who will defend it, but for the most part, no one's defending zero tolerance anymore. And policies have shifted, and suspension rates have come down. Now racial disparities persist, and we know that. But so anyway, I'm saying that we need to also we need to study and lift up successful models. People have to believe and know that things can change in order to become part of an organizing process.
That's right.
And now we're in a new era. But how well will our movement? I guarantee you that organizing will happen. Parents and young people in communities will organize for a better education and a better
That's right.
future. How long, how much power they can build and what the strength of their opposition, the forces against them will be. I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen over the next few years with this. But I guarantee you that organizing is going to happen. And the question is whether it be successful, what success is actually going to mean. And, can we also stay on stay on track to have a vision that we don't want to just go back to education the way it was. That wasn't working for most of our children or many of our children anyway.
Amen to that.
So, we have to also organize to imagine, a future where education is part of liberation for young people, empowered in their lives, liberating their communities, and not just the reproduction of, white supremacy. Let's face it. So I think, I know we're on the same page on that, Zakiya, but I think that's important to continue to lift that up. We're not talking about just going back to the COVID or pre-pandemic period. We want to
No,
move
no,
forward
not at all.
with
We
the
can't
future.
afford to. We simply
Yeah,
can't afford to. Mark,
yeah.
this has been great. We are just about at time here. This has been. See how we just flow? Like
I
we
know.
that didn't even seem like an hour, right?
No,
It didn't
no,
even
no,
seem
no.
like we've sitting here talking for a whole hour. But just want you to have an opportunity
Yeah.
to lift
Oh
us
yeah,
up
the book.
again, so people can know. We did put in the comments. Mark is the author of this book in collaboration with
Hmm.
contributors such as myself and other groups that we've talked about here. And these are all the voices from the front lines of the educational justice movement included in this book. So, yes, please go to
Okay.
liftusupmovement.org, and you can also get a free download on Kindle.
Yep.
So
All right.
thank you all. Thank you, Mark, so much. I
Okay.
know that you're working on another book. When that book drops, we're going to bring you back, maybe
Okay.
even bring a couple of more of the
Yeah.
contributors. I'm still
Yeah.
a contributor, but we can have
Yeah.
a roundtable panel discussion and talk about where we go from here. Particularly, hopefully, at that time, we'll have a better sense of where education is evolving to. I tried to get in a little bit of that today, but like you're saying, education is happening so differently depending on where you are in the
Hmm.
country. I do think that we need to worry about technology and in the
Right.
disruption and making sure that we get in front of that. Not, and I want to be clear, not that technology is necessarily bad in and of itself, but we have to get in front of it to make sure that it's done with equity. It's not done to people, but done with people. And we have to
Right.
make sure that our education systems and even the technology companies are not forcing things down parents and students' throats without full buy-in. That's all I
Right.
wanted to get to. But we'll have plenty of more time to talk about this. I want to tee up that next week we have a very special show. We're going to be bringing on some panelists. We have one person I think is missing from that, but we'll add them on. Terrain Walker is going to be one of our guests as well. He is the founder of Context Media. He is also a journalist. Dr. Jarrett Ball, who is a professor of communication studies at Morgan State University, and also, right, the incomparable Nina Turner, who is a former Ohio State Senator. I had an opportunity, Mark, to work with her when we were first pushing to
Right.
end Ohio's zero tolerance law. She was on the
Hmm.
Senate Education Committee. So
Okay.
I'm very proud to say that I had the pleasure of working with this wonderful woman as a senator in the state of Ohio. She represented the Cleveland area at that time. And so, as we know now, she is a national commentator. She has a new podcast, and I'm very excited that I get an opportunity to interview her next week. So, thank you all so much.
Okay.
This has been your edition of Grassroots Education Advocacy Building Power. And we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Mark. We'll bring you back.
Okay. Thank you.
Take good
Okay.
care.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.